So this story is all about a man called John. John was a small farmer in South Kerry. He had a few sheep and a few cattle, and he was very, very happy. He lived on his own. And every morning he got up early, got his food ready to take down to the animals, and he was very happy. He had a little dog with him, and he'd take the dog along the road and head down with his bucket to feed the animals. And every morning he would see a crow, a fox, and a hare. And the crow would be sitting up in a bush or on the wire, and she'd be looking around, and she'd give a croak when he'd see him. And the fox would be cleverly watching and might hide in the bushes when he came along. But the hare would always kind of dance around him and run down the road. And John was fine out feeding all his animals until one day a small little black puck goat arrived in with the sheep. And he didn't know what to do. And he put the word out that there was this black little puck out there, and would anybody know of who owned it? And nobody came forward, and nobody knew who the puck goat was. So he said, sure, look, he's doing no harm. I'll feed him as well as the sheep and the few cattle. He'll be all right there. And time went on, and he was feeding until one morning he was going down, and the crow was there, and the fox was there, but there was no sign of the hare. So he went in, he fed the sheep, and the little puck goat was there, and the cattle were there as well, and he fed them. And when he was coming out, he heard a small, a little screech. And when he went over, there was the little hare, and its leg was caught in thorny wire. Somebody had left the thorny wire, they hadn't done anything with it. And he said, oh, you poor little thing. So he got the wire, and he unraveled it, and he freed the hare, and off it ran down the road. And he didn't think any more of it. So the next morning, he got his bucket, he filled up his stuff, he had the little dog with him, and he headed over the road. And there was the crow, and there was the fox, and there was a beautiful woman with fair hair and a glossy green, a beautiful dark green dress on her with gold braiding. And he looked at her and he said, who are you? And she said, I'm Gura, the hare that you saved yesterday, because if you hadn't unraveled my leg from the thorny wire, I'd definitely been a grúchas now by today. And he said, and you're a woman? She said, yes, I'm one of the Celtic goddesses of the land, and I've been watching here. That little black puck is one of my little pooka, my children, and I'm just minding and making sure everything is all right. And I see how kind you are to pooka as well, she said. So I'll make a deal with you. I'll do something very nice. There's a small little job going at the moment. And he said, oh, a job? Well, I said, I'm very busy. And she said, look, you only have to work 4 nights of the year. On Samhain, on Imbolug, on Bealtaine, and Lunasa. The 1st of November, the 1st of February, the 1st of May, and the 1st of August. The nights before that, you just have to work 4 nights. And what you have to do is put on the cape of the bioland. And what this cape is, it's all of nature is in this cape. And when you put it on, you can listen to nature, you can talk to nature, and you connect all the bits of nature that needs to talk to each other. The birds might need to talk to the fish might need to talk to the plants might need to talk to the birds. And once you get all that done, you can do a small bit of work for yourself on your land or the other people's land. Oh, he said, this is all right. I think I'll do that. And she said, but you have to be very careful because only you can do it. Oh, he said, no problem at all. I'll be fine out. I'll do that. So she left him in the care. She said, you know something? I leave pooka here. I leave pooka here to be looked after by yourself, and I'll go looking after all my other fairy children all over the country. So off she went, and John was very happy, and he kept farming, and it was coming up to Iha Haun, Halloween night, the 31st of October, and he said, I better go down. So he went down into the field, and who was there but Gura came back to show him what to do. And she just put her hands out in the field and grabbed up this beautiful cloak and it was made of all the grasses of the field. There was heather, there was fedjuk, there was furze, there was everything in this cape. And he put it on, and he walked through the field, and as he walked along, he disappeared into the land. And there he was in his own head, just spread out, and he was totally nature. He could see everything, and he could see that there was these small people coming in from the sea. They were called urchins, and for them to reproduce, they had to turn into the birds of the land, and they would sit in the field and they would lay their eggs just like the birds would, but out of these eggs came more urchins, and they went back out into the sea. And he thought this was amazing, and all nature used him to communicate with each other. And the fish were talking to the seabirds, and the seabirds were talking to the land birds, and the land birds were talking to the mammals, and the mammals were talking to the plants, and the trees, of course, were talking to each other, because trees never stop talking. And they were all a chat. And he said, you know what? She said, I could do a small bit with the nature around. So he went around South Kerry, and he gave all the grass and all the beautiful plants, he gave it an extra bit of growth, and the trees, and everything came up greener, and everything came up just that bit nicer. So all the farmers were very happy, because their animals had more grass to eat for the winter ahead. And then eventually he took off his cloak, and he left it down in the field again, and Gudda was waiting. And she said, you did a mighty job there. She said, what you have to do now is make sure where you see where the cloak is, because I have a load of work to do. So coming back to the last night of January before the 1st of February, put on that cloak again and make sure all nature gets to communicate with each other, and you can do helping out the nature around South Kerry as well. And that's what he did. But he didn't realize that when he was putting on the cloak and when he was taking it off, things looked a bit different. Things looked a bit strange. And there was people, they saw something and they weren't too sure what it was. One person thought it was a teepee that children could go in and watch birds from, or something like that. And another person thought it was actually a rare bird itself. And there was one woman in the village, and she was a real busybody. She wanted her hand stuck in everything. No matter what was going on, she had to be there. If you were dying, she'd be dead. And she saw something, and she couldn't put her finger on it. And she said, you know something? There's something weird there. And then she saw John coming out of the field, and she took a lighting set on him. She would watch him in the morning, she would watch him in the evening, she would watch him during the day. Any time at all he was doing anything, she was there watching him. And that was Chuv was her name. So anyway, Chuv kept watching, and John kept farming, and he had the black little pooka, and he was feeding the pooka away, and he had all the sheep, and he was feeding away. And you know, it was very lucky, because it was a very, very nice winter. And he had everything growing nicely. Come on down, Grover. Come on. That's the doggy now. She's looking for crack going on. She's looking for attention. So anyway, everything went fine until it was coming up to the 1st of February. And he went over and he put on the cloak again. And he looked out at all of nature were having a huge meeting, and they were talking to each other, and everything was going on. Everything was going great. Come on over, Grover. And everything was going fine, and he could see everything. And he went around South Kerry, and he lifted up all the growth again. He gave the bushes, all the furze, all the grass. He started everything growing nicely. And after a while, he could see that the poor urchins were having a terrible time, that their houses were being blown in by the sea. There was terrible, terrible storms down by the sea, and he couldn't, of course, control the weather, but he could control nature and the growth of things. Yes. And he said, oh, the poor things. And they were calling out for buttonweed. This old sailor that had lived there before, and he'd saved a lot of people, and he'd saved the crew that drowned, but he drowned saving the crew. And the little urchins were calling from, they knew that they might help him, but there was no sound at all. And while he was doing all this, of course, who was watching him? Only Chuv. And Chuv was looking, she's saying, there's something odd going inside in that field. I can see little sparks or something. I don't know what it is. And anyway, John took off the cloak in the same place and he left it down and he walked out and she saw him again. And she took note of where she saw him in the field because he wasn't there a minute ago. And she said, So she kept waiting and she kept watching. And then it was coming up to the 1st of May, the last night of April. And she was looking over and she said, I'm going over to that spot. I want to see what's going on. So she went over and she was grappling around in the dark. And wasn't she able to find the cloak? And if she did, she put it on. And then all of nature went through her and all the animals and all the birds and all the trees and plants were talking to each other. But she was listening in and she was like, who's that? What's going on? Why are you talking? And where's the cloak from? How do I get the cloak? And she saw that she could affect the nature. And of course, she was a selfish old biddy altogether. And she said, you know what? All her land, she brought loads and loads of growth out from everywhere. And she took the growth from everywhere else. So all her neighbours, they had no growth at all. All their grass and their crops were very bad that year. But she had a fine crop, of course. And of course, she was walking around and then she threw off the cloak in the field. And she said, that's great now. I'll have a great crop. I'm all right, Jack, kind of business. So she came back anyway, and she was going on, and she went back, and she was delighted. And Jack was out there, and he couldn't find the cloak anywhere. And he said, oh no, Greta's going to be so upset. But of course, nature was all right. It was able to communicate through Chuv, so it wasn't too bad. But it was like he was trying to figure out, he couldn't find the cloak for the next night coming up, for Lunasa, for August. And of course, she had a great crop altogether. Chuv had a brilliant crop growing and everything was going fine. But because she was so greedy, because she was horrible, that got into the system of nature. And under the sea, there was a lot of old gloopy old stuff that people have dumped in there for ages. And that started stirring. And her greed and her selfishness came out into that gloop and it came up out of the water. The poor sea urchins didn't know where to go. They ran off in terror because they saw this horrible creature come out of the water. And he was looking around and he was trying to destroy something because he was so greedy and, you know, he'd never been cared for. And because even Chuv never had been cared for, and that seeped into him, and he was out there trying to terrorize something. He saw the seasons coming and he attacked them. He saw bits of nature, he attacked them. He saw the shoreline and he attacked it. All the urchins' houses he knocked over and they had nowhere to live. Now, the urchins had a leader, and she usually lived out in the Skelligs, but she heard all this tumult going on around the land and the shoreline and everything, and she came in. Fervor was her name, and she came in a little scallop shell was her boat, because she was a tiny little person, and she had the razors like 2 oars, and she came in, and she saw all the houses destroyed and turned over, and she said, oh my God. And she saw all the nature was getting an awful battering from this old gloop kind of a thing, this other horrible creature. And she said, where has he come from? And she couldn't figure it out. So she went off to find Gwydr. But of course, that creature, and she was so small, Fervor, she was important and she was strong. And who did she ask to go to find? But the crow. Because the crow was another minder of Pooka, and she said, go off and find Gwydr, and we have to get him back here to figure out what's going on. So the crow went off to find Gwydr. She found John, and she explained to him that something's gone into the matrix of the nature, and there's something selfish and there's something horrible gone in there. And he said, you know, I didn't want to say anything, but I couldn't find the cloak the last time. I know somebody used it, but I don't know who it was. And she said, we have to find that person. We have to find that person, put him back in there and get out that selfishness and that horribleness that's in them. So Gwydr came back, and they were all over the field looking for the cloak. John couldn't find it, Gurif couldn't find it, because it was so well made that it would just lie out in the land and you'd have to be picking and struggling. And wherever she left it, did she leave it in the field at all? Did she bring it home with her? And they were looking all over. And of course, who was the only one that found it? Only John's dog. It was a very clever dog. I think Grover was her name. And Grover found the cloak anyway. So he was able to put it on. And nature came all over him again. And he was able to fix everything up, except he was spread out all over. All the fish were talking, all the plants were talking, and he was trying to figure out what's going on when this gloop came along. And he was trying to destroy John. Now that John was at his weakest and Gloop could see him, he could really destroy nature and get in there. So while John was doing all this and the Gloop was attacking John, Fervor was out with the dog, and Pooka, and they were all out trying to find out. And didn't, of course, the one with her curiosity, there's nothing like it. Chuv was at the side of the ditch looking over through the bushes to see what was going on this time, because she was happy enough now that her crop was growing so well. And of course they caught her and they brought her over, and Gura forced her to put on the other side of the cloak, where they were like head to toe now, herself and John. And there she was, and she had to face Gloop, and she had to face her own selfishness and her own greed, and that got rid of Gloop. And John took off the cloak, and she took off the cloak. She ran away screaming. She said, "Never again, never again, never again." And Gura said, "Now, John, 'tis too complicated. I think we better keep people out of nature." And she spread the cloak all over South Kerry. And that's the way the biosphere came about, the reserve. And that's where all nature talks to each other. And the land goddess is now called Eleanor.